So welcome everyone to Perry Worldhouse for this event, Disarming the World, Uniting Nations for Nuclear Non-Proliferation. Today's program demonstrates the critical importance of the multilateral international system in achieving the goal of non-proliferation and disarmament. The United Nations Office of Disarmament Affairs is the principal office charged with achieving this goal, and we are really lucky to have its highest representative here with us today. Now, for those of you that don't know Perry Worldhouse, well, Perry Worldhouse is both this building, but also is the conceptual place on campus where the Penn community comes together to hear from the world's leading experts, thinkers, government officials, and members of the United Nations on the most important issues and questions facing the world today. And of course, today is no exception as we think of this really, really central and important issue. So I am absolutely delighted this afternoon to introduce to you Her Excellency, United Nations Under-Secretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Izumi Nakamitsu. So Ms. Nakamitsu, prior to serving in this post, was the Assistant Administrator of the Crisis Response Unit at the United Nations Development Program, and she also has many years of experience within and outside the UN system, most recently as Special Advisor on follow-up to the Summit on Addressing Large Movements of Refugees and Migrants, Director of the Asia and the Middle East Division in the United Nations Department of Peacekeeping Operations, and Director of the Department's Division of Policy, Evaluation, and Training. So we're delighted to have Ms. Nakamitsu back with us today, and she'll be joined on the stage by Adam Taylor. Mr. Taylor writes about foreign affairs for the Washington Post. He's based in DC, but travels frequently to report, most recently to Ukraine to focus on Kyiv's counteroffensive and the high costs of rebuilding the country. Originally from London, he studied at the University of Manchester and Columbia University. We will forgive him for not studying at the University of Pennsylvania. However, he has joined us today at Perry Worldhouse. So please join me in welcoming our guests to the stage.
Well, first off, thank you everyone for being here, and thank you for Perry Worldhouse for hosting this event. I think we can agree it's a pretty interesting time to be talking about nuclear disarmament and the United Nations in general. It's been roughly a year and a half since Russia invaded Ukraine, and has set off a round of nuclear threats, really the sort of things that we haven't seen in the generation, not since the Cold War. At the same time, a lot of the sort of long-standing nuclear proliferation problems are still existing, from North Korea, the debate about the Iran nuclear deal, the tensions between India and Pakistan, and we really could go on and go on. In this context, it's interesting to find out what the world's top multilateral institution, the United Nations, is doing here, particularly in this time when multilateralism is really under threat from a lot of self-interested and sort of short-term thinking. And also there's a lot of different requests being made of multilateralism, from preparedness for pandemics, the global economy, and so on and so on. So I guess my first question would be, in this very interesting time to be working on nuclear disarmament, where is UNODA getting support? And where is it sort of finding the mandate to go after this, its agenda?
Well, thank you very much for this meeting. Interesting time, impossible, very difficult time as well. We actually work on the basis of mandates, and we do have a very general overarching mandate to work on and then supporting member states in the pursuit of a world without nuclear weapons when it comes to nuclear file. And interestingly, we still do have a lot of support. And let's not forget that UN is 193 member states, right? And there is actually a very strong understanding, awareness that the nuclear weapons risks is very high. We often say that it's at the highest since the depth of the Cold War. There are a lot of member states that are really concerned about that. So, we have those states that are really, supporting us, encouraging us, pushing us to pursue nuclear disarmament together with the entire membership of the United Nations. Now, also nuclear weapon states, P5 or N5 and others, let's not forget that pursuit of a world free of nuclear weapons is still a strongly held joint objective of the entire UN membership, which means that no one, including nuclear weapon states, have actually backed away from that. So I would say that the support, I would even say that there is a strong expectation on the part of UN member states that the United Nations as a whole continues to work on these issues. And I would say not despite the international security context, but I would say precisely because of the current international security context. So, I mean, put simply, we do have mandates, we do have support, we even have expectations from large number of UN member states that we continue to work very tirelessly.
I know you were recently in New York for the high-level meetings at the United Nations General Assembly. One of the things we saw there, and obviously this has been going on for years at this point, as the divisions on the Security Council. It's kind of remarkable now to think that perhaps even as not so many years ago, there was a level of consensus on some nuclear non-proliferation issues, such as North Korea on the Security Council. These days, it almost looks to be going in the reverse direction. What challenges does that present for UNODA's mandate and nuclear disarmament, and what sort of ways around them can you see?
Well, I mean, when the Security Council is not working as it should, there is a huge problem. I mean, that is the primary organ of the United Nations that is responsible for the maintenance of international peace and security. But as we all know, it's not functioning the way it should be. Now, there are very difficult challenges associated with that. I mean, just to name a few, many of the world's most difficult conflicts and wars do not get resolved. And that's the top level, of course, challenges and the problems. But at the same time, there is also an interesting phenomena. I would say that there is a large number of UN member states coming together to really reflect on what it is that we need to change about the Security Council. That's one. And also there is a sort of voice and perspectives that gets really repeated to give greater roles to the General Assembly, for example, in the areas of peace and security issues. Now, you would definitely say that, but the GA resolutions are not legally binding, as opposed to the Security Council resolution adopted under Chapter 7. But my response to that will be, but let's not underestimate the voice of the international community and the power of numbers, if you will. We saw that a couple of times last year related to GA resolutions related to the Ukrainian war, of course. But in the arms control, disarmament area, also the voice of the majority and the power of the number throughout the history have actually made some interesting results as well. I mean, the most recent one is the 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. But back in the 1990s, there was the example of the CTBT, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, that got stuck in the CD, the Conference on Disarmament, brought to the General Assembly. So there are ways in which we can move files. And then unfortunately, there is no silver bullet. There is no one easy solution. If you do this, everything will be fixed. Unfortunately, the international community, the multilateral world doesn't work like that. So it's a variety of mechanisms and processes that we need to make sure we will use to the maximum. Now, as the UN Secretariat, our role is, of course, that of advocacy. A recent interview by the Secretary General with Christian Amanpour, he said, we have absolutely no power. We don't have money. What we have is the voice. The power of voice needs to be really maximized. We have still, I think, a very strong convening power. We are also substantive secretariat, meaning that we can work with others, the expert communities, to bring about interesting options for, advancing nuclear disarmament and put that available to member states. We are also bridge builders. We are honest brokers. We try to find common areas rather than focusing on disagreements. We try to find areas of convergence and common understandings, and building on that, try to find a way forward. So there are a number of things that we believe we can still do in the current very difficult context, and we will definitely not stop doing that.
One of the features of the UNGA Week was a lot of attention on the global South, and you saw that in President Biden's speech, and you've seen that in various statements from Russian and Chinese officials as well. I wondered if you would be able to describe, is the global South unified on disarmament, nuclear disarmament, I mean, and if so, how can they make that voice known through the General Assembly or through other forms of, perhaps soft power?
Yes, I mean, the vast majority, as I said, in terms of numbers, vast majority of member states really do support nuclear disarmament. In fact, one of the reasons why the TPNW, the Prohibition Treaty, came about was a strong frustration on the part of the global South, non-nuclear weapon states, at the very slow pace of nuclear disarmament, the stalled implementation, I would say, of the Article 6 obligations of the NPT. So there's a very strong sentiment. We need to move the file. We need to make progress. And they are, the member states that will support our work in the multilateral settings. And then we need to make sure that those countries' perspectives also will be reflected in multilateral discussions. Now, again, the picture, the balance in the multilateral debate is always very complex and complicated. So it's very important to make sure that you understand the various positions, and you identify your allies and supporters in a given file. And I think that is definitely one of the approaches that will lead us to a progress in multilateral settings. There are also groups of countries that are able to reach out to both sides of a division. Sometimes it is across regional groupings like NPDI, Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Initiative, 10 countries in the middle, that can actually discuss these matters with nuclear weapon states, but also discuss these issues with non-nuclear weapon states. That's across regional groupings. They are, generally speaking, global South call for progress. And increasingly important is the what I call the middle countries, and not in terms of a middle power, but those countries influential in nuclear disarmament files, Brazil, Indonesia, Egypt, South Africa, those countries that really see nuclear disarmament as one of their foreign policy priorities. I think what's important we need to remember is that they see disarmament as, their security concerns. I mean, I think there is a very concerning, for us, false narrative, which is that nuclear weapons provide ultimate security. We are trying to counter that. Nuclear disarmament is a very practical security instrument. It has always been during the Cold War, and there are a large number of states in the global South. They believe nuclear disarmament is also their security. So we need to make sure that we work with those countries as well.
I wanted to follow up on that last point. I mean, you said it's a false narrative that nuclear weapons bring security. You certainly do hear in Ukraine this sort of idea that if Ukraine was nuclear armed, or if it was under NATO's Article 5 protection, which would imply nuclear weapons protection, it wouldn't have been invaded by Russia. And I can certainly see why some, world leaders or people around the world in non-nuclear armed countries would look at that and say, yeah, that makes sense to me. What is the sort of argument against that?
Well, I think one, factually speaking, Ukraine was never a nuclear weapon state. It was the arsenals that existed in the today's Ukrainian territory were Soviet nuclear weapons. The command and control systems always, was in Moscow. So I think we need to make sure that we understand the sort of historical background to that. But also, when we see the situation today, nuclear weapons, being used as a weapons of coercion, and so it is very clear that nuclear weapons actually are not providing the ultimate security for everyone, and so I think we need to counter that narrative. And also we need to make sure to remember, if you will, that nuclear disarmament, arms control, non-proliferation, those were developed throughout the history as practical security instruments. It's not a utopian ideal that's tried to be, peaceful and nice. That was not the idea of nuclear disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms control. So we want to get back to that, original idea for disarmament. I mean, the example that I use very often is the, only 1 year after the Cuban Missile Crisis of '62, a partial test ban treaty was a reality.
Mm-hmm.
And that is based on the realization that if you pursue unlimited arms race, it will backfire on your security yourself. So you have to sit down and risk, reduction is immediate, urgent requirements, but then that would have to be also developed into a concrete agreements on arms control. So let's try to recall that historical facts.
It's sort of related to that subject because of the war in Ukraine and the related tensions surrounding it. Russia has suspended its participation in the New START treaty. I wondered what role you thought bilateral agreements like that between Washington and Moscow should play, and how they should interact with multilateral institutions and multilateral agreements.
Well, thank you for that question. Disarmament is actually not just multilateral. It's a box composed of various instruments, and bilateral agreements really key, especially New START in today's context. Sometimes it's a unilateral declarations. There are a number of important multilateral agreements. So the disarmament toolbox is a complex, box, and then within that, the bilateral agreements by two largest nuclear powers is absolutely critical. If the New START is let to expire without any successor arrangement, it would be the first time since 1970s that we don't have any cap in nuclear arsenals. And that, I would say, everyone understands as a very dangerous, very risky proposition, especially, against the background of everything that is happening in the world today. So we really want the two states to return to full implementation to start with, and then, of course, find a way to re-engage and negotiate the successor arrangement. That will be absolutely critical. But this Russian invasion of Ukraine has really impacted a nuclear disarmament file enormously. One of the direct impact is, of course, the nuclear New START treaty, but there are a number of other areas as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. With regards to North Korea's nuclear program, obviously we recently had the meeting between Putin and Kim. I wondered if you thought, how you thought that had changed the prospect of non-proliferation or denuclearization talks with Pyongyang, and whether there was a path to sort of making progress on that.
Well, one of the reasons why there was, important discussions that were able to be held at the multilateral setting until about several years ago was because the Security Council was united on that. Complete denuclearization, verifiable, irreversible, etc. Now that Security Council P5 unity no longer exists, and that is fundamentally one of the biggest problems related to the issues related to DPRK's nuclear program. So one first step that we need to really reconstruct is that the P5 sees this challenge. It is a very concrete security challenge in the region and beyond. They have to return to working out and finding a common ground to address that issue. I think the countries in the region also needs to come together and find a way. But I must say it is one of the most difficult files that we have at the moment.
Going back to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the 2017 agreement, that was obviously a huge win, I think, for the sort of cause of denuclearization. And it got a lot of sort of the voices and perhaps not usually heard when people are talking about global denuclearization on board. At the same time, if you go back and read a lot of the sort of discussion of it at the time, there was the hope that it would sort of stigmatize nuclear weapons, that it would delegitimize them. Just sort of 5 years later, we're seeing perhaps more discussion of nuclear weapons ever, certainly more nuclear threats. It's how do you view that sort of aim now? Do you think it was successful? Do you think it's on the path to success? And what else can be done in terms of delegitimizing nuclear weapons?
Yeah, as I said, nuclear disarmament toolbox is composed of various treaties. TPNW has entered that toolbox, and it has become a very important treaty. But I think, what we commonly refer to as a cornerstone of nuclear disarmament remains the NPT, also because of the legally binding obligations for nuclear disarmament under the Article 6 of the NPT. So what we need to look at is how those different instruments can come together and collectively move nuclear disarmament file. The TPNW countries themselves, I don't think they expect that the TPNW alone will achieve nuclear disarmament anytime soon. That treaty is still in the process of developing itself. There are a number of work that is being done by states parties of that particular treaty. There are some interesting new dimensions that were brought into nuclear disarmament discussions, such as victims assistance. More human-centered approach taken in the TPNW is quite new approach. But also, I think Ireland and Thailand, they're leading their work to articulate a complementarity between the TPNW and NPT. So that treaty itself is still being developed. So we need to make sure that we look at that treaty as part of the overall nuclear disarmament toolbox. Now, coming to NPT, if I may, that is under a lot of pressure. We know what happened. We all know what happened last year in August at the 10th Review Conference. Unfortunately, they were not able to adopt consensus outcome. But I continue to say that the fact that for 4 weeks, in the midst of invasion in Ukraine still ongoing, states parties of the NPT were able to have really in-depth conversations about nuclear disarmament, I think in itself is a remarkable achievement. So we need to make sure that NPT process will continue to function. And there is a working group that met also this year in July, just before the first preparatory committee of the NPT, to strengthen the review process. And then one of the key aspects of states parties' concerns was how to improve transparency, accountability, and reporting, when it comes to previous commitments made, especially by the nuclear weapon states. So we have to really insert energy into NPT platform as well. On the TPNW, I hope that the November 2nd meeting of the states parties, this time it will happen in New York under the presidency of Mexico, will continue to demonstrate, their complementarity and then their strong push, support, reinforcement for NPT Article 6 implementations.
For all the reasons we've been discussing, obviously nuclear weapons and nuclear non-proliferation are sort of the center of public discussions in a way they haven't been for a long time. That's not just the war in Ukraine, but it's also things like the Oppenheimer film. It sort of entered pop culture in a way. I wondered, do you think there's an element to this that could be useful for getting people to think about something that perhaps has not really been thought of in a generation? I mean, you mentioned the NPT. Obviously, that evolves, but it is a 50-year-old agreement. So perhaps there's new ways of thinking about this that can come from this.
I hope so. I think I always thought that when the risk is increasing and then it reaches a certain level, then everyone understands that you can't actually cross the risk threshold, or else that will backfire on all of us. And I think we are approaching that point when it comes to nuclear weapons. That is an existential threat that concerns everyone. So I do very much hope that the current extremely risky environment will turn the sort of public opinions, number one, to make sure that everyone takes this issue as, everyone's concern. And it's not sort of a technical questions that experts only can be discussing. It's not the case. I think this is everyone's security, so it has to be, in a way, popularized or socialized in the public opinion. But going forward, I think we need to really make sure that we understand the new security, international peace and security environment. The world is really changing or has changed. We are going through a massive paradigm shift, and we need to make sure that we actually capture that and understand that, and try to sort of, if you will, craft a new approach, a new vision going forward in nuclear disarmament. More immediately, what we need to do is to protect the gains that we have made so far. A number of international arrangements, agreements are eroding. We need to stop that, and we need to protect the gains that we have made. But at the same time, we need to actually think about what it is that we need to do with a new approach in the new context, new security context that we see. One of the key issues here is the technology, intersection of weapons of mass destruction, artificial intelligence, cyberspace, outer space. Those things actually have become a really acute issue. We think that it might be a future sort of a scenario. It's not the case. We need to do something now. We have to intensify our discussions, and unless we are able to, start thinking about what kind of governance and regulations we can make, it might actually become too late. So coming to Oppenheimer, it is, many people talk about Oppenheimer moment. Oppenheimer moment, when it relates to governance of technology, new technology, is, I think, probably very soon.
Yeah, I mean, people love to compare AI and nuclear weapons, and I think I saw a headline comparing Sam Altman to Oppenheimer recently. And in terms of what we've learned from decades of trying to achieve nuclear disarmament, are there sort of clear lessons, do you think, that would be applicable to AI at this point?
I think there are a number of useful lessons, but AI is very different. So intangible technology, how to actually restrict and regulate, potentially inspect and verify. I don't think there is any applicable existing models in the international community today. So there again, we need to be very creative. I'm all for really learning lessons from the past and in the history. In the recent policy brief issued by the Secretary General, New Agenda for Peace, it only came out in July this year. Disarmament is a really central pillar of that new agenda for peace. Everything nuclear, but also a lot of technology issues really featuring very strongly. And what the Secretary General said in that report is that based on the international experiences or inspired by the international community's experience in the past that led to the establishment of IAEA, or IPCC for the climate and International Civil Aviation Agency, ICAO. Let's learn from those inspirations from the past, but then we need to be very creative, and that will be really useful and effective in the governance of artificial intelligence. Governance, I say, both peaceful uses, we have to make sure that the benefits will be maximized. In the SDG context, the only way to salvage the implementation of achievements of Sustainable Development Goals is probably in the technology area, if we can maximize the use of technologies. But also the other side of the governance means that we need to regulate and really make sure that the malicious use will be regulated and prevented. So there's a lot of work ahead of us, and this all comes to all of us. I think each and every one of us will need to take the responsibility in thinking through and voicing our opinions, because this is, as I repeat again, this is about our security.
And just one final question from me before we go to the Q&A section of this. We speak a lot about nuclear weapons because they are so destructive and so dangerous. But at the same time, a lot of conventional weaponry is actually what is really harming people right now. You go to Ukraine, obviously, there's anti-personnel landmines, for example, or now there's going to be cluster munitions, things that could leave a very negative, lasting impact on the country and will kill people. How do you balance the sort of, in your role at UNODA, how do you balance the sort of nuclear disarmament ambitions with the sort of conventional weaponry, and how one is almost a bit more theoretical and one is very, very real?
Yes, thank you for that question. I mean, indeed, in the context of Ukraine, it's the conventional weapons that are killing people, not just in Ukraine, but, all of the other conflict situations. And there again, I think there are actually a lot of things that we can do if we actually put our efforts, resources, capacities together. In the New Agenda for Peace policy brief, we put them together and then put a sort of phrase of human cost of weapons. We need to address that. Now, there are different strands of work that we are doing. One thing is that we need to make sure that there is a stronger norm created and also implemented when it comes to the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. That's straightforward Ukraine. Those large caliber explosive weapons are not to be used. I mean, they're not to be used in populated areas. They are battlefield weapons. So we need to make sure that that area of, that field norms are, strengthened and then actually implemented, but also small arms and light weapons area. if we have good program of action, which is politically binding, what we want to do is to bring those norms and various instruments that the international community, the member states have been making, will be brought to the country level and on the regional level with the support of the international community, including the United Nations, to be able to implement them. And then implement them in the context of bringing it as a sort of integral part of their development cooperation plans as well. So there are many different ways of, these are just two examples. As you say, cluster munition is a big concern in Ukraine. Also, a lot of arms transfer going into any conflict zone. We need to make sure that there is no diversion. And so there are a lot of work that we need to do and we could do, and that's why we need to bring together, variety of member states to work on these issues.
Great. And I think with that, we'll open it up to questions from the floor. There's a microphone over there if people want to make their way over there. Oh, I think we have one from the Zoom. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, from the online audience. So in addition to the other tools you mentioned, can you also discuss the role of P5 process relative to nuclear risk reduction steps, as well as potential unilateral transparency and confidence building measures?
Yes, thank you very much. P5 mechanism continues to take place as we understand. We're not part of it, so we're not there to discuss with the P5, but we understand from all of them actually inform us that it's continuing on a regular basis at the expert level. It's not at the senior officials level, but they seem to be having very concrete discussions on risk reduction measures. And that's a welcome thing. So it's interesting to see that, when the sort of geopolitical tension is making those P5, some of the P5 countries to directly engage in bilateral consultations, the NPT framework, the P5 framework, is providing that opportunity. And we always encourage P5 to continue that and continue to actually demonstrate some progress. I think the risk reduction is a really, as I mentioned, urgent requirement. Nuclear weapons actually accidentally or by miscalculation being used. I mean, that sort of scenario really must be prevented. So we support the P5 or N5, nuclear 5 efforts to continue to be engaged in the N5 dialogue.
Thank you for the great panel. My question comes from a context of being a student in chemistry and also sort of representing my peers doing research in high energy physics and whatnot. These sorts of discussions that we talked about today constantly appear within our friend groups. And we talk about our different funding sources and where everything goes in the end, and how our research might involve ethical concerns that we even haven't thought about yet. But we find that the entry point into this discussion is somewhat difficult. You mentioned that also UN has the role of including more voices from experts, not only in perhaps international relations, but perhaps who know the impact such new technologies can have. Particularly, for example, when the fusion research was announced, we were so excited while watching the press conference, only to have our hearts broken when the potential weaponizing of the technology was immediately mentioned afterwards. So how do you think we can incorporate more voices from the experts in natural sciences, perhaps, and sort of open the discussion to more perhaps concrete consequences and stuff like that? Thank you. Great
question. And we are starting to address those issues. Actually, this year's high-level week, there have been lots of technology-focused side events, which I had to participate. I'm not a scientist, so I feel very inadequate to be speaking about this. But the reality of today is that a lot of security issues really intersect with those variety of, STEM field. One event that I participated was intersection of AI and biology. Biorisk is really going to be something new, something entirely different from what we used to think about when the Biological Weapons Convention was made. So it's generally speaking a really key area. And I also engage very often with young sort of scientist and engineer type of people. I went once to India Institute of Technology and faced really smart people like yourself. What I find important is that we need to introduce and really promote the idea of responsible innovation. And, you know, for example, in the AI field, what I learned is that, you know, within, I think it was like within a couple of hours, 6 hours, the AI found 70,000 potentially lethal chemical substances. So the barriers of weaponizing those, whether that is a chemical substance or biological agents, with the intersection of those new technologies like artificial intelligence, is really the barriers getting much lower, which means that those people who are engaged in research, development, designing, those scientists themselves really need to understand what it is that responsible innovation is all about. But then, of course, responsibility cuts across everyone. It has to be really the design, you know, responsible design, development, deployment, and use. So we need to make sure that, you know, this concept of responsible use and development of various technologies will be really promoted and mainstreamed across the board. And then we do have some projects in this area involving young scientists. I'm sure that this will feature very strongly in the, you know, the United Nations now have an office for youth. The youth office, I'm sure, will take some of those issues as one of the key areas of work. And I would encourage you to engage with us. There are a number of organizations, including the UN, you know, looking at those issues from the security point of view. So we will like to engage people like yourselves in those work.
Thank you so much.
I think we got time for a few more questions. So people try and be quick because we got a few to get through, but please go on.
Hello, thank you for coming. So there's been a great deal of pressure on North Korea for leaving the NPT, and there are other behaviors surrounding nuclear weapons. So is there any additional pressure by the UN on the other non-parties of the NPT? This would be like India and Pakistan that almost engaged in a nuclear war between each other a couple of decades ago, and also, of course, Israel.
Yes, we often talk about NPT, but there are others, a few others that are outside NPT that are nuclear possessors. And the reason why the Conference on Disarmament, CD, in Geneva is there and it really should be functioning, one of the reasons is for that reason. Because the CD involves those other nuclear possessor countries. Unfortunately, as we all know, I think CD is celebrating, you know, quarter of a century non-negotiation state. And so reactivating disarmament machinery itself is a major priority. I think it should be a major priority for disarmament community. And that is why the Secretary General's policy brief on new agenda for peace included a very precise, particular recommendation on reviewing and reactivating the entire disarmament architecture, because many different parts have fatigue, many different parts have political problems, and it's really important that we, you know, reactivate and reinvigorate those architecture, disarmament architecture overall.
Thank you.
Hello, nice to see you again, Undersecretary General. My name is Nom Sandongwe. I'm a research fellow at CNS, a former diplomat in Geneva who'd spent 3.5 years in the CD. And I'm glad that you mentioned how much it's become deadlocked and moribund, to be quite frank. My question has to do with the Summit of the Future for 2024. And in your view, just from the academic side where I am now, looking at some of the more topical, not topical, but like the issues that are getting a lot of attention, like the Global Compact for Technology that's being led by former Ambassador Amandeep Gill, and even the youth initiatives, then we look at disarmament and nothing is happening. So when we're talking about reinvigorating disarmament, is there anything planned for the Summit of the Future to have those issues actually be discussed in a dynamic way? Thank you.
Well, Summit of the Future is about everything from climate to international financial architectures. Peace and security is, of course, one of the very important priorities for the Secretary General, but whether specific disarmament issues, topics will be discussed, I doubt that will be the case. Therefore, I would say, what is really important is that those variety of disarmament issues and the recommendations that the Secretary General puts in a new agenda for peace will actually have a process of concretization in terms of discussions and negotiations. And that means that different parts of the disarmament architecture, next week, we have the first committee starting. And I hope that some of the substantive topic will also start to be taken up in that context. So we need to have the summit next year. That summit will hopefully have the Pact for the Future, which will include commitments or recommitments by the member states on disarmament, on various issues, but including disarmament. But then we need to make sure that there is a concrete multilateral process underneath that so that actions can be taken. And then we are in discussions with a handful of key states in that regard. I think it's very important that we make sure the Conference on Disarmament will somehow reinvigorated. And I know that the CD ambassadors in Geneva have actually been discussing that. There might be a few recommendations, discussions that might start next week in the first committee, but all of those things have to come together. As I said, it's a complex field. Multilateral field is very complicated. Formal discussions and negotiations in the multilateral processes, including CD, first committee, very important. But discussions like this is also quite important. I will also underscore the key importance of engaging with civil society, academia, expert community, because I think the disarmament really needs some new vision, new approaches, some of which have been included in the new agenda for peace. But the technology areas is some area that we really need to put our heads together and start having some concrete options laid out. So the work definitely is ahead of us.
Thank you.
You've talked a little bit about the framework for disarmament, but I'm curious about just the diplomatic practicalities. Obviously, disarmament is difficult because states think that having these weapons is in their national security interest. A nation like the United States wants to be able to defend against Russia or China. North Korea wants to be able to defend against basically everyone. And the states tend to think that if the fewer weapons they have, the less firepower they have to defend themselves against another nuclear aggressor. So I'm curious, how do we overcome this problem of self-interest? Do you think it's even possible to do that in the near future? Or should we focus on proliferation because that's a little easier than actually getting states to give up their nuclear weapons?
I will put the last one first. Non-proliferation is key. But the reality is that non-proliferation and disarmament are two sides of the same coin. If we only say non-proliferation, And then some states will say, well, then what about you guys? You said that we will disarm, we will work on disarmament, and that's why we have the non-proliferation obligations. So if they don't see the disarmament part progressing, or if they don't believe that those states with nuclear weapons have any intention of disarming or working on disarmament, then those states will say, well, then why should we stick to our non-proliferation obligations? So it's really the two sides of the same coin. If we only focus on one, it's not going to work. So that's also international sort of a reality. Now, whether this is a possibility, I would say yes, but I also emphasize that it's right now. I think it's a need. We need to start making some real progress. And the reason simply is that this is about, again, I go back to this. This is about security. Nuclear weapons being used by accident or miscalculation, those risks are quite unacceptably high. And the only way to solve this is through negotiations. I said that DPRK is probably one of the most difficult files, but even on those specific country case, the only way is through diplomacy and negotiations, because you can't go to war to resolve those issues. So it's just a very difficult reality. However difficult it is, we just have to find a way, or at least try to find a way to sit down, start dialogue. And then probably the key factor is, again, the risk. We need to achieve a common understanding of the risk factor. When we can do that, then it will probably become one of the entry points for discussions.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm back again with a question from the online audience. It seems that much of the nuclear concerns in Ukraine relate to nuclear power facilities. How does that fit in with the UN's efforts?
Yes, thank you. It's one of a few impact of invasion, Russian invasion in Ukraine. Definitely, it's a new issue. The international community never had to deal with a nuclear power plant, largest one in Europe, in an active war zone. So it is one of the huge concerns. But there are other impacts on the nuclear. I mean, frankly speaking, it's the first time that there is a veiled threat of use of nuclear weapons happened. That's with Ukraine. So that's a huge impact. And then, because of the war in Ukraine, the already tense relations between nuclear powers have really deteriorated much further. So there is different dimensions of Ukrainian war impact on the nuclear file, but definitely Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, nuclear safety and security issues, one of the huge issues. Now, UN is actively involved in this, and the agency of the United Nations that is dealing with this issue is the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency. They have a permanent presence on the nuclear site in Zaporizhzhia, and they are in constant regular contacts with both sides of the war. My colleague, Rafael Grossi, the Director General of IAEA, has been very active and managed to secure agreements from both sides on the 5 principles of making sure that they would not be Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plants would not become a direct target, and then leading us to a catastrophic accidents in the European continent. But it is definitely one of the huge impacts that the war in Ukraine have given on the nuclear file.
I think we have time for one very quick question. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so please go ahead.
It has been a pleasure listening to you and to both and the interview. So informative. Thank you for coming. There is I think what you had suggested about responsible innovation makes a lot of sense. And especially the way you saw it as a package from design to development and so on, and use. But the difficulty is what the famous Cambridge University economist Joan Robinson had once said, in the long run, it is all about the short run. In other words, how do we look at what the other gentleman had said, consequences? How do we understand, who does it, responsibility to whom? Who pays, who benefits, who decides? The same issues as in cost-benefit analysis. So what would you say to that?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer. I guess it's, the short-term cost-benefit analysis is one thing. It's just, really short-term gains. I think we need to make sure that, we're here at the university, one of the top universities in the world, educational institution. I think there will have to be a sort of basic understanding on the part of everyone that your innovation could actually change, really, Oppenheimer, change the world. And the best person to actually inform us in diplomatic field, in policy fields, to inform the potential risk actually is the people who are innovating, who are actually making those innovations. And so maybe there should be a basic sort of, education on the part of everyone that includes the ethics and human rights and humanitarian law considerations. I said that I went to India Institute of Technology. One of the questions that I received from those real bright people is that, well, I talked about international humanitarian law, how the human society, international community has been developing the norms of distinction, proportionate, use of force, etc., civilian versus combatants. And the student said that, well, we've never learned anything. We don't know anything about international humanitarian law. Why doesn't the United Nations offer those courses to everyone in this, SNT field, the STEM field? Everyone should really have a basic understanding of those, international law, international principles that are really underpinning our human society as a human race. So maybe I think that sort of a thinking is what is required, so that scientists and engineers will be more driven by longer term interests that concerns everyone, rather than a very short term financial interest.
Thank you.
That wraps up the Q&A. And thank you so much for all the questions. I think they're really a good selection of questions. And thank you so much to the Undersecretary for taking the time. I know you had some train troubles getting here, so it's always impressive when people travel to answer some pretty tough questions sometimes. Thank you.
I'll just add my thanks, Undersecretary General and Mr. Taylor. Really great pleasure. I have to say, though, in your last comment, as the chair of the philosophy department, it warms my heart to hear the call that every student in the world should take an ethics course. Of course, we highly endorse this plan. So thank you all for being here today. I also wanted to say, for the students in the room who asked about further engagement on these issues, please consider this one of your avenues to do so, and seek me out afterwards, seek Tom out afterwards, and we can actually talk about ways that those of you coming from STEM fields interested in these issues could actually begin to engage in the multilateral process, or kind of in the policy process in general. We shall certainly take up your offer on that as well, Miss Undersecretary General. Thank you for participating, and I want to let you all know that at 4 o'clock today, this conversation will continue. The topic then is 90 seconds to midnight, Nuclear Dangers in the 21st Century, and it will feature Rachel Bronson from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists and John Rolfling from the Nuclear Threat Initiative. So for those of you here in person, and for those of you online, again, thank you for joining us today. Those online, you'll have to make your own lunch. For those of you in person, just behind you, you can grab some lunch on the way out. Look forward to seeing you all back at 4 p.m. Let's thank our panel again.